Sarah Whitmore didn't cry when they handed her over. She'd used up every tear the night before, alone pressing her face into a pillow so thin it barely muffled the sound. By morning, she had nothing left but a carpet bag, a pair of worn boots, and a name on a contract she hadn't signed. Ethan Calloway took the paper without looking at her, tucked it into his chest pocket like a land deed, like something owned. And somewhere on Red Hollow Ridge, 2 small children were waiting for a mother they didn't know they needed. If this story moves you, subscribe and follow along to the very end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The morning they sold Sarah Whitmore, the summer air already tasted like iron and dry grass, the kind of heat that made everything feel permanent and punishing. She stood outside Beaumont's general store on the main road of Cutter's Bend, with her carpet bag at her feet and her hands folded in front of her like she was waiting for church, not a stranger on horseback. She was 18 years old. She had $17 to her name, not in her pocket, but in the ledger of her debt, which meant she had nothing at all. Harold Finch stood 3 feet to her left, his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, satisfaction spreading across his face, the way grease spreads across a pan. He was the man her father had borrowed from. He was the man who had held that note for 6 years, collecting interest the way other men collected grievances, quietly, patiently, and without mercy. "He'll be here by 9, Harold said, not to Sarah, to the air beside her as though she weren't standing right there. "Calloway's a punctual man, I'll give him that." Sarah's jaw tightened. She didn't look at Harold. She kept her eyes on the road that led out of Cutter's Bend, the long pale scar of it cutting through summer-scorched earth, heading north toward the mountain ridge that sat blue and enormous against the horizon. She'd never been past the ridge. Nobody from Cutter's Bend went past the ridge unless they had to. Most people who went past the ridge didn't come back the same. "You don't have to look so aggrieved," Harold said, finally addressing her directly. "This is a fair arrangement. You work off your father's debt in a household. You get room, board, shelter, better than most girls in your situation." "My situation," Sarah repeated. Her voice came out flatter than she intended. "You mean being sold?" Harold's expression tightened. "Nobody's being sold. This is an employment contract. With terms I didn't agree to. Your father agreed to them. My father is dead, Mr. Finch." A beat of silence settled between them. Harold smoothed the front of his vest. "All the same." That was the whole of it. All the same. Her father was dead. The debt was real, and Harold Finch had found a solution that benefited everyone except Sarah Whitmore. A man up on Red Hollow Ridge needed a housekeeper. Harold Finch needed someone to absorb 6 years of accumulated interest. The math was simple, he'd told her 3 days ago when he'd explained the arrangement. 18 months of service. Then she was free. Free. As though she'd been in chains before, and the chains were simply changing shape. She heard the horse before she saw it. A dark sound, hooves on hard-packed earth, deliberate and unhurried. Then the animal came around the bend in the road, a big buckskin 16 hands at least, moving like it owned every inch of ground it crossed, and the man on its back rode the same way. Ethan Calloway was not what she'd expected. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected. Something rougher, maybe. Something louder. The men she'd heard about who lived up past the ridge were usually described in one of 2 ways. Either they were hermits who'd gone strange from too much solitude, or they were dangerous men hiding from something. Sometimes both. She'd braced herself for either version. What she got was a man who looked like neither. He was tall in the saddle, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that didn't read as peace, but as control, the kind a man develops when he's learned that movement costs him something. He had dark hair gone a little long at the collar, a jaw that needed a shave, and eyes the color of creek water under cloud cover, pale gray and difficult to read. His hat was pushed back slightly on his head. His coat was leather-worn, soft at the elbows. He rode with one hand on the reins and the other resting on his thigh, and he didn't hurry the horse, not even now. He pulled up in front of Harold Finch and looked down. "Finch," he said. That was all. "Calloway." Harold straightened slightly, which interested Sarah in an involuntary way. Harold Finch didn't straighten for most men. "Right on time. Said I would be. Ethan Calloway's gaze moved then, slowly without performance, to Sarah. He looked at her the way you look at something you're trying to understand, not something you're trying to impress. His eyes moved from her face to her carpet bag to her hands, then back to her face. Whatever he was calculating, he kept it behind his expression. "This is Sarah Whitmore," Harold said. 19 next spring. Strong, capable. Her mother ran a household of 7 before. "I can speak for myself," Sarah said. Harold blinked. Ethan Calloway's expression didn't change, but something shifted in it. A recalibration. "Then speak," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. Not unkind exactly, but not warm. Sarah looked up at him. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She'd had enough real things to be frightened of that she'd stopped spending fear on impressions. But she felt something now looking at this man on his big, quiet horse that wasn't quite fear. It was more like standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down and knowing you were going to have to jump regardless. "I don't know what Harold told you about this arrangement," she said. "But I want you to know that I'm here because I have no other legal option, not because I agreed to it. I'll do the work I'm contracted for. I'll do it honestly. But I'm not property, Mr. Calloway, and if you expect me to behave like I am, you're going to be disappointed." The street was quiet. A woman across the road had stopped to watch. A man outside the barber shop was doing the same. Harold Finch looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. Ethan Calloway studied her for a long moment. Then he reached into his chest pocket and pulled out a folded paper, the contract, her father's debt in black ink, and held it out. "Read it," he said. She took it, unfolded it. Her eyes moved over the language. Standard terms. 18 months of domestic service. Room and board provided. Wages offset against the debt balance. Release upon completion. "You're not indentured," he said while she read. "You're employed. There's a difference. The difference being I can leave. The difference being you agreed to stay. I didn't." She stopped, looked at the bottom of the page. Her own name in handwriting she recognized as her father's. Not her handwriting. Her father's. But the name was hers. He'd signed on her behalf. 3 months before he died, according to the date. The paper went slightly blurry. She folded it carefully, handed it back. "I see," she said. "I've got 2 children," Ethan Calloway said, still from the saddle. "Mason is 7, Lily is 5. They haven't had a woman in the house since their mother left 2 years ago. I need someone who can manage a household and keep an eye on them while I work. That's the whole of it." Sarah absorbed this. Their mother left. Something moved across his face, brief and controlled. "Yes." "Where did she go?" "That," he said, "is not part of the contract." He swung down from his horse in one smooth motion and picked up her carpet bag before she could reach for it. Not gallantly, practically, like it was the most efficient use of motion. He tied it behind the saddle with 2 quick knots. "We've got a long ride," he said. "You can sit behind or walk. Your choice." Sarah looked at the horse, looked at the road, looked at Harold Finch, who had the decency at least to look away. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up behind the saddle. Ethan Calloway mounted in front of her. She grabbed the back of the saddle and held herself as far from him as the animal's width allowed. He didn't comment on it. He clicked his tongue at the horse, and they moved. Cutter's Bend fell away behind them. The ride was 4 hours, and he said maybe 40 words across all of it. Not hostile words, not cold words, just spare ones, the way some men use language, the way others use matches, only when there's something specific that needs lighting. He told her the names of the passes they crossed. He told her which water was safe to drink. He told her that the summer on the ridge ran hot in the afternoons and cold at night, and that she'd want her heavier clothes accessible, not packed deep. Practical information delivered plainly with no particular concern for whether she found it welcome. She found herself listening carefully despite herself. The mountain was enormous up close. It had looked manageable from Cutter's Bend, the way distant things always look manageable. Up here, moving through the switchbacks and the steep timber, it felt like something that had its own intentions. The trail was narrow in places, and the drop beside it wasn't something she looked at directly. The horse moved through it like it had done this 1,000 times, which it probably had. "Have you always lived up here?" she asked somewhere around the second hour, mostly to break the silence that had started to feel like pressure. "No," he said. She waited. He didn't continue. "Where did you come from originally?" "Farther west." "And you came here because it suited me." He shifted his weight slightly in the saddle. "You ask a lot of questions." "I'm riding toward a place I've never been with a man I don't know, to work in a house I've never seen. I thought questions might be reasonable." A pause. "Fair enough. You don't have to answer them." "I know." They rode. A hawk crossed high above them, banking in the summer thermals without any apparent effort. The timber was thick on both sides, pine and spruce, the smell of it sharp and green and resinous. "Your children," she said. "Mason and Lily. You said they haven't had a woman in the house for 2 years." "That's right." "How have they been?" The question clearly landed differently than she'd meant it. She felt him still fractionally in the saddle. "What do you mean?" "I mean a 5-year-old without a mother for 2 years. A 7-year-old. That's not nothing. I'd like to know what I'm walking into if you're willing." Another long pause. The trail widened here and the horse picked up a little speed. "They're rough," he said finally. "Lily doesn't talk much. Mason talks too much, most of it at the wrong times and aimed at the wrong things. They don't take to strangers." "Have there been many strangers?" "You're the first woman I've brought up here since Eleanor left." The name dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water, and then he sealed over it again fast, like he hadn't meant to say it. "Eleanor was their mother," Sarah said carefully. "Yes." She didn't push it. She filed it away instead. The name, the 2-year gap, the way he'd sealed over it. There was something there that mattered, even if she didn't know yet what it was. The cabin appeared through the trees without much warning. She'd expected something bleak. What she found was something that had probably once been considered, maybe even loved by whoever built it. A solid log structure with a porch along the front. A stone chimney at one end, 2 outbuildings visible behind it. The porch had a bench. There was a kitchen garden running along the south side, overgrown now but not dead. Whoever had planted it had known what they were doing. What the place felt was empty, even from the outside, like a house that had been breathing and then stopped. Ethan swung down and tied the horse. Sarah climbed down on her own. She stood looking at the cabin while he collected her bag. Then the door opened. A boy appeared on the porch. 7 years old, she registered, dark-haired like his father, with the same kind of watchful stillness. But where Ethan Calloway's stillness felt like control, this boy's felt like assessment. He was barefoot despite the afternoon heat. He had a smear of something on his jaw, and a posture that said he'd been watching the trail for a long time. Behind him, barely visible in the doorway, a smaller shape. A girl. Lily. She had lighter hair than her brother, and she was holding the doorframe with both hands, and she was watching Sarah with enormous dark eyes that didn't blink. Sarah did not wave. She did not smile, the performed smile of someone trying to seem safe. She looked at them the same way she'd looked at the mountain, directly, honestly, without pretending it was smaller than it was. "Mason," Ethan said. "Lily, this is Miss Whitmore. She's going to be helping with the house." Mason looked at Sarah, then at his father. "For how long?" 18 months. "Then she leaves." "That's the arrangement." Mason's expression was carefully neutral, in the way children's expressions are when they've already decided something but haven't announced it yet. "Does she cook?" "I cook," Sarah said. "Reasonably well." "Do you eat what's put in front of you? Or are you the kind of boy who makes that difficult?" Mason blinked. He hadn't expected to be spoken to directly, she could tell. Most adults spoke about children to each other as though the children were furniture that had ears. "Depends on what it is," he said. "Honest answer," she said. "I can work with that." Lily hadn't moved from the doorway. Sarah turned her attention there slowly, The way you turn toward something skittish without making it feel like pursuit. "Hello, Lily," she said. Nothing. The girl's hands tightened on the doorframe. "You don't have to say anything," Sarah said. "I'm just telling you hello, that's all." Lily stared at her for another long beat. Then she disappeared back inside the cabin without a word. Ethan watched the doorway for a moment. The set of his jaw said something, his voice didn't. "Come inside," he said. "I'll show you where things are." The inside of the cabin was bigger than she'd expected, and messier than it needed to be. Not filthy Ethan Calloway clearly maintained it at a basic functional level. The floor was swept if not scrubbed. The dishes were washed if not organized. But there was a layer of settled disorder over everything, the accumulation of a household being managed by a man who understood maintenance but not comfort. Blankets folded square and hard on the chairs. Curtains that were clean but hung crooked. A kitchen with everything it needed except warmth. She walked through it and cataloged it without comment. Ethan walked her through the rooms, the main living space, the kitchen lean-to, the 2 sleeping areas, and named what things were and where they came from, and how they worked in the same spare, practical way he'd given her trail information. She listened and stored it. "The children share the room on the left," he said. "You'll take the room on the right. I sleep in the loft." "Where did you sleep before?" He paused. "The loft. And before that?" The pause was longer. "That's not something that needs addressing." She let it go. He stood in the center of the main room and looked at her with something she couldn't quite name in his expression, not quite uncertainty, but something adjacent to it. Like a man reviewing a decision he'd already made and had committed to regardless. "The work is straightforward," he said. "Cooking, cleaning laundry, tending the garden if you can get it back under control. Keeping an eye on the children when I'm working the property. I'm out from before sunup to sundown most days, sometimes longer." "What do the children do when you're working?" "They manage." Sarah looked at him. "They're 7 and 5. They know the property. They know the rules. They stay within the fence line." "Do they?" Something flickered across his face. "Mostly." "Mr. Calloway." She kept her voice level. "I'm not trying to criticize the way you've managed. I understand you've been doing this alone. But if you want me to be useful, I need to actually understand what the children's days look like, what they eat, what they're afraid of, what makes them." "They're not afraid of anything," he said. Not defensively, just factually the way he said most things. Sarah looked at him. Lily was holding that doorframe so hard, her knuckles went white. He didn't answer. "Every child is afraid of something," she said. "Especially children who've lost something they didn't have words for yet." The room held his silence for a moment. Outside, she could hear Mason's footsteps crossing the porch back and forth, restless. "You can do what you think is right for them," Ethan said finally. "Within reason." "And what does reason look like here? No coddling, no lies, no promises you don't intend to keep." That last one landed differently. She could hear the specific weight behind it. "I don't make promises I don't keep," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and walked out through the kitchen toward the back of the property. Sarah stood in the middle of the cabin. She breathed in the smell of it. Pine smoke, dry wood, something like iron, and something like cold. The curtains shifted in a draft from the uneven window seal. On the floor near the cold hearth, she noticed something she hadn't seen on her first pass through a small cloth rabbit, its ear held on by a single crooked stitch sitting propped against the stone like it had been put there deliberately. She crouched down and looked at it without touching it. Lily's probably. Placed there maybe because the hearth was the closest thing to warmth in a room that didn't have any. Sarah stood up. She looked around at the cold kitchen, the crooked curtains, the dish towels folded with military precision, and no sense of comfort. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The first supper was a study in silence. She made cornbread from the stores in the dry cupboard, and a venison stew from the meat she found cold-packed, and the root vegetables she salvaged from the back of the kitchen shelf. Simple things. Nothing that required pretense. Mason watched her cook from the table with his chin in his hand. He watched the way children watch when they're trying to figure out whether something is a threat. She didn't perform ease for him. She just cooked. Lily sat on the floor near the hearth. The fireplace finally lit now because Sarah had lit it with the cloth rabbit in her lap. She wasn't doing anything with it, just holding it. Ethan came in from outside and washed his hands at the basin and sat at the head of the table without fanfare. He looked at the pot on the stove and then at Sarah and said nothing. She served it. He served. Mason ate, not enthusiastically, but steadily with the focus of a child who is genuinely hungry and has learned not to make that into a performance. Lily came to the table when Sarah put a bowl down there for her. She sat. She looked at the stew. "It's got carrots," Mason said. "I know," Lily said. The first words Sarah had heard from her, small voice, careful, like each word cost something. "She doesn't like carrots," Mason told Sarah. "I can eat around them," Lily said with the dignity of a much older person. Sarah sat across from her. "Or I can take them out." Lily looked up. Something shifted in her expression. Surprise maybe that the offer was plain. No fuss, no bargaining. "Okay," she said. Sarah took a spoon and moved the carrots to the side of the bowl, making a small, neat pile. Lily watched this operation with complete attention. "Thank you," she said, barely audible. Sarah nodded. She looked up and found Ethan watching her from the other end of the table. His expression was unreadable. She held his gaze for one beat, then looked back at her bowl. They ate. The fire was the loudest thing in the room. After supper, Sarah washed the dishes. Mason appeared at her elbow and after a moment of hovering, picked up a drying cloth without being asked. She didn't comment on it. She handed him the rinsed bowls, and he dried them, and they worked together in the quiet way of people who don't yet have a language, but have found a task. "You made the fire bigger," he said. It was cold. "Pa doesn't usually make it that big." Is that a criticism or an observation? He considered this seriously. An observation. All right. He says wood doesn't last if you burn it too fast. He's not wrong, she said. But there's a difference between wasteful and enough. Tonight, I chose enough. Mason was quiet for a moment. What happens tomorrow? Tomorrow I'll look at the garden. It's pretty bad. Most things are when they've been left alone. He handed her back a dry bowl. Miss Whitmore. Yes. Where did you come from before? She took the bowl. A town called Cutter's Bend, about 4 hours south. Did you want to come here? She looked at him, 7 years old, looking back at her, without any armor at all, just the question unadorned. No, she said, not at first. He absorbed this. Pa didn't want Eleanor to go, he said. But she went anyway. She kept her voice steady. What happened after she left? Pa didn't talk for a while. He picked up another bowl and dried it methodically. Not about her, not about much. He just did the work. And you? Mason set the dry bowl on the shelf. I did the work too, he said, like it was obvious, like it had never occurred to him that there might be another option. Sarah looked at this 7-year-old boy who dried dishes without being asked and told the truth without apology and kept his sister close and had been doing the work for 2 years, and she felt something sharp and quiet happen in her chest. You're a good brother, she said. He looked at the shelf. I know, he said. And then very quietly, she still cries at night sometimes, Lily. She doesn't think anyone hears her. Does your father hear her? I don't know. He doesn't say. Sarah dried her hands on a cloth. She looked out the small kitchen window at the dark that had come down over the ridge, thick and absolute, the kind of dark that cities never got. I hear things, she said. I'll be right down the hall. Mason looked at her. Something in him was working through something. She didn't rush it. Okay, he said finally. He put the drying cloth over the rack and walked out of the kitchen. She heard him cross the main room and disappear into the children's bedroom. Sarah stood alone in the kitchen. The fire she'd built had finally taken hold of the room, properly warming the air from the floor up. She thought about Cutter's Bend, about Harold Finch's face when she'd gotten on that horse, about the contract with her father's name at the bottom. Then she thought about a small cloth rabbit propped against cold stone, and a boy who did the work without being asked, and a girl who said thank you, like each word was valuable currency. She went to check that the fire would hold through the night. Then she went to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and let herself feel alone in the dark all the things she hadn't felt in front of anyone today. When she was done, she lay down. She stared at the ceiling. Down the hall behind a closed door, she heard it, the faint, careful sound of a child crying soft and private, the way children cry when they've learned there's no point in crying loudly. Sarah closed her eyes. She didn't sleep for a long time. She was up before the sun. Not because she'd slept well, she hadn't, but because lying in the dark listening to a house breathe was worse than doing something with her hands. She'd learned that early in the years of her father's illness, when worry had a way of becoming physical if you let it sit still long enough. Movement was the only cure she'd ever found. The kitchen was cold. The fire she'd banked the night before had gone down to coals, and she rebuilt it from those coals the way her mother had taught her, carefully, without waste, feeding it small pieces first until it was ready for the larger ones. Her mother had said that patience with fire was the same as patience with people. You couldn't rush either. You had to earn the heat. She had water heating before the first bird started outside. She had the oats on before the light changed from black to gray. By the time the mountain was doing that thing it did at dawn, that slow unveiling like something enormous, deciding whether to show itself, she had bread dough working on the counter and 3 eggs located in the back of the cold box that nobody had thought to use. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on the floorboards overhead measured deliberate, and then the creak of the loft ladder. And then Ethan Calloway was in the kitchen doorway, hat already on, coat in his hand. He stopped when he saw the state of the kitchen, the fire, the pot, the dough. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You're up early." "So are you?" she said without turning from the stove. He came in and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd already set. She heard him drink, heard him set the cup down. "The oats will be ready in 10 minutes, she said. "The bread won't be done until mid-morning, but there are eggs if you need something now." "Coffee's enough." "It isn't," she said. "But I won't argue it." She heard rather than saw something change in the quality of his silence. Not irritation. Something more like recalibration again. Like a man who kept expecting one thing and kept getting another, and hadn't decided yet how to account for it. "I'll be on the north fence line today," he said. "Storm came through last week and took a section down. Won't be back until dark." "All right. Mason knows where the water well is and how to work the pump if it sticks. Don't let Lily near the east edge of the property. There's a drop-off past the big pine stand she doesn't know about. I'll find it and mark it. You don't have to. If I don't know where a danger is, I can't keep her from it." She turned then because the sentence needed a face to land correctly. "I'd rather know." He looked at her. That measuring look. She met it without moving. 40 yards past the last fence post on the east line, he said. "The ground falls away fast. She's only gone out there once and I was with her." "Thank you." He set his coffee cup in the basin. He was at the door when she said, without particular weight behind it, "Mr. Calloway." He turned. "Last night," she said. "Lily was crying. Around midnight. Not loud, she was being quiet about it. I thought you should know in case you didn't." Something crossed his face, gone before she could read it properly. "I heard her," he said. "What did you do?" The pause was long enough to mean something. "Nothing," he said. She settles herself. Sarah kept her expression steady. "I see. It's not—" He stopped, started again differently. "I don't always know what to do with them," he said, and it clearly cost him to say it. Not because it was a weakness, but because it was true, and Ethan Calloway seemed like a man who had made his peace with most truths, except the ones that lived in this house. "She cries, and she settles, and in the morning she's fine. I figured interfering makes it worse. Sometimes, Sarah said. And sometimes it makes a child think no one is coming. He stood in the doorway and said nothing. I'm not criticizing, she said. I'm telling you what I know. You can do with it what you want. He put his hat on properly and walked out. She heard him cross the porch, heard the horse, heard the sound of it diminish as he took the north trail and the morning swallowed him up. She let out a long breath, turned back to the stove. The oats were ready. She went down the hall and knocked twice on the children's door. Breakfast, she said. Plain, no performance. Footsteps. Then Mason opened the door already dressed with the gravity of a child who had been managing his own mornings for long enough that it no longer felt like a choice. Behind him, Lily was still in her nightgown, hair tangled, rabbit clutched against her chest. Oats, Mason told his sister in a tone that said he'd assessed the situation and determined it was safe. Lily looked at Sarah over his shoulder. No carrots and oats, Sarah said. Something almost happened on Lily's face, not quite a smile. The idea of one. I know, she said carefully. Come when you're ready, Sarah said, and went back to the kitchen. Mason appeared in 2 minutes. Lily in 4. They ate. Sarah ate with them, which seemed to surprise Mason. She could tell by the way he glanced at her twice before settling into his bowl. She suspected previous arrangements, whatever they'd been, had not included meals as shared events. What are you doing today? Mason asked. The garden first. Then I want to look at the rest of the stores and figure out what's needed. The garden's real bad, he said. You mentioned. Pa says there's no point fixing it until fall. Your father and I may disagree about that, she said. Is that going to be a problem for you? Mason looked at her with the expression of someone being asked a question they hadn't anticipated needing an opinion about. No, he said slowly. I reckon not. Good. Lily was watching this exchange with the careful attention she gave everything not passive Sarah had realized, but deeply observational. The child was always watching and cataloging. She just hadn't decided yet what she was going to do with what she found. Miss Whitmore, Lily said softly. Sarah looked at her. Yes. Your hair is like Aunt Clara's. Mason went very still in the way of a child who knows something significant has happened, but isn't sure what. Tell me about Aunt Clara. Sarah said the same way she said everything plainly without making it into a larger thing than it was. She used to visit, Lily said. Before. She stroked one ear of the cloth rabbit. She had yellow hair like yours. She smelled like soap. Clara was Ma's sister, Mason said quietly. She stopped coming after Ma left. Pa wrote her a letter, but she never wrote back. The kitchen held that information for a moment. I see, Sarah said. Then, because the moment didn't need anything added to it, who wants to come look at the garden with me? Mason pushed back his chair. Lily looked at her rabbit, then at Sarah, then stood up with the careful deliberateness of a child making a decision she intended to stand behind. They both came. The garden was, as Mason had accurately reported, real bad. 2 years of minimal maintenance had let the weeds take significant territory, and the summer heat had done the rest. But the bones of it were still good, she could see that. Whoever had designed it had known what they were doing. Whoever had loved it had done so thoroughly enough that even 2 years of neglect hadn't entirely killed what they'd built. Eleanor, she thought. And then put it away. Here's what we're going to do, she said. She crouched down at the edge of the bed and pulled up a handful of weeds, roots and all, and held it up. Everything that looks like this same leaf shape, same color, same stem gets pulled. Everything else gets left alone until I've looked at it. Questions. Mason picked up a weed and examined it with scientific interest. What if we're not sure? Then you bring it to me, and I look at it. Don't guess. Guessing in a garden gets you pulling things you want and leaving things you don't. Like people, Lily said to her rabbit. Sarah looked at her. Exactly like people, she said. They worked for 2 hours. Mason worked with efficient, systematic energy, moving through the rows with the same focused practicality he brought to everything. Lily worked more slowly, more carefully, occasionally stopping to examine something closely before making her determination. She asked questions when she wasn't sure. Each time Sarah looked at what she'd brought and gave her a plain answer, Lily filed it away with visible satisfaction. Sarah watched them out of the corner of her eye and felt something she recognized from her own childhood, the particular comfort of useful work done alongside someone who expects you to be capable of it. By mid-morning, the near beds were cleared, and Sarah's back was aching in a way she welcomed because it was honest and earned and hers. She straightened up. Lily was sitting at the garden's edge, with the rabbit in her lap, running her thumbnail along a leaf she'd decided was interesting. Mason was 3 rows over, still working with the same focused efficiency. "Mason," Sarah called. He looked up. "Go get us some water. There's a pitcher inside on the left shelf." He dropped his handful of weeds and was up and moving before she finished the sentence. She hadn't asked, she'd directed, and he'd responded without question. She noted this. He was a child who had been operating as a small adult for long enough that he responded better to expectation than to request. He needed to be needed. She understood that. She sat down next to Lily in the dirt. Lily looked at her without alarm. She'd moved closer over the course of the morning, Sarah had noticed. The perimeter was shrinking. "What's the rabbit's name?" Sarah asked. Lily considered whether to answer this. Then, Button. "Good name." "Mama made him." Sarah kept her voice entirely steady. "Did she?" Before she went. Lily turned Button over in her hands, examining the crooked stitch on the ear. "The ear came loose once. Mason fixed it. He's not as good as Mama at sewing, but he tried." "The trying matters," Sarah said. Lily looked up at her then, directly the way she rarely did. Her eyes were a complicated color, not quite brown and not quite green, and in them Sarah could see the particular expression of a child who has a large question and has been carrying it alone and hasn't found a safe place to put it down. "Miss Whitmore," she said. "Do you have children?" "No," Sarah said. "Do you want some—" "Lily," Mason said, appearing with the water pitcher and apparently having caught the last exchange. "You can't ask that." "Why not?" "Because it's—" He looked at Sarah. "Sorry." "Don't apologize for her," Sarah said. "She asked a fair question." She took the pitcher from him and poured water into the 3 cups she'd brought out earlier. She handed them out. "Someday," she said to Lily. "Maybe. I haven't had much occasion to think that far ahead recently." Lily drank her water and thought about this. "We don't have a mother anymore," she said. "In case you were wondering." "I wasn't wondering," Sarah said. "But I'm glad you told me. Pa doesn't talk about it." "I know." "Do you know why?" Sarah looked at this 5-year-old girl sitting in the dirt, asking why her father had gone silent 2 years ago, asking it with the directness of someone who had tried every other way of getting an answer and found them all blocked. "I think," she said carefully, "that when people lose something that matters very much, sometimes the words for it are hard to find. It doesn't mean they don't feel it. It just means the feeling is bigger than the words." Lily looked at Button. "That's how it is for me too," she said. "Sometimes." "I know," Sarah said. "I can tell." Mason was quiet on her other side, drinking his water with both hands around the cup, the way he held everything with complete attention, as though objects might get away from him if he didn't hold them properly. "She's not coming back," Mason said. Not a question. The flattest, most certain statement she'd heard from him. "Mason." "I know she's not. I've known for a while. He set the cup down. "Nobody says it, so it just stays there, not said." Sarah looked at him. 7 years old, with 2 years of unsaid things sitting in his chest like stones. "She's not coming back," Sarah said, plainly, without cruelty and without softening. He breathed out. Something in his shoulders changed almost imperceptibly, but she saw it. "Okay," he said. Then he picked up his weeding again, and the conversation was over, and she let it be over because he'd gotten what he needed from it, and anything more would have been for her sake, not his. They went in for the midday meal. Sarah made pan biscuits and heated the remaining stew from the night before. Lily set the table without being asked, 3 places precisely arranged, and Mason brought in water. They moved around the kitchen with her in a way that was clumsy, but genuine, still learning the dimensions of this new arrangement, but not resisting it. She noticed the way they oriented toward her physically. Not dramatically. Just Mason sat closer to her end of the table than he had at supper. Lily put Button on the chair beside Sarah's instead of her own. Small gravitational shifts. Barely perceptible. Absolutely intentional. She ate her biscuit and did not let herself feel the full weight of it. Not yet. Not with 18 months ahead of her and a man who had come home from the north fence line yet. That afternoon, with the children resting, Lily actually sleeping. Mason reading a worn primer he'd retrieved from under his bed, with the reverence of a boy who'd read it enough times to have memorized it, but read it anyway. Sarah went through the stores properly. She found not enough flour for 2 more weeks at any reasonable pace. Salt pork running low, coffee adequate, sugar almost gone, cornmeal sufficient, beans plentiful, but that was the ceiling of it. She found on the back shelf behind the cornmeal a small tin box. She didn't open it. It wasn't hers to open, but she noted its position pushed far back, half hidden, with the particular attention of someone who was learning the geography of other people's grief. She wrote a list on the back of a piece of brown paper from the wrapping of the salt pork. Provisions needed prioritized. A trip to Cutter's Bend or somewhere closer would be necessary within the week. She left the list on the kitchen table where Ethan would see it. Then she went outside and found the east fence line and walked it to the last post and stood at the edge of the drop-off Ethan had described. It was worse than she'd imagined. Not a slope, but a genuine fall 20 feet or more, heavily overgrown, so you wouldn't know it was there until you were already going over. She marked it in her mind, a gnarled juniper 3 paces left of the last fence post. Unmistakable. She'd know it in the dark. She was walking back toward the cabin when she heard the crash. Not loud, but specific. The sound of something falling that shouldn't have fallen, and then silence where a sound should have followed it. She was running before she'd made the decision to run. Inside, Mason was standing in the middle of the main room with his back very straight and his face very still, and a look in his eyes that she'd seen before, not in children, but in adults who were managing something they didn't want to lose control of. "Where's Lily?" Sarah said. He swallowed. She was trying to get Button down from the shelf. She climbed the chair and it. "Where is she?" She went outside. She got scared and she ran. Sarah went straight and through the door. "Which direction?" Mason pointed. "East." Sarah ran. The ground was uneven and the afternoon sun was in her eyes, and she ran anyway, calling Lily's name once, not frantically controlled the way you call when you want someone to come toward you and not go further away from the sound of fear. She found her 40 feet from the east fence line. Lily was sitting on the ground behind a pine tree, very small, knees pulled up, face buried. Button was clutched in her arms so tightly the crooked ear was bending. Sarah slowed, walked the last 10 feet. She sat down on the ground next to Lily, not in front of her, beside her. She didn't say anything. She just sat. Lily's shoulders were shaking. The cry was the same one from last night, tight and careful and controlled, because she'd learned control too young, and it had gotten into her breathing. Sarah sat beside her and did nothing else. After a minute, Lily leaned sideways and put her head against Sarah's arm. She didn't ask. She didn't say anything. She just leaned. Sarah put her arm around her and held her there in the dirt under the pine tree, and Lily cried the way she needed to cry, which was not quietly, but fully shaking and loud, and without any attempt at dignity whatsoever. Sarah held on. She didn't tell her it was all right. She didn't tell her to stop. She just held on. When Lily finally went still, Sarah said, "The cliff is about 40 feet from here. You know that." Lily pulled back enough to look at her. Her face was a wreck, and she didn't seem remotely concerned about it. "The one Pa says stay away from?" "That one. You weren't near it today." but I need you to know where it is, so you always know how far is too far." Lily sniffled. "Will you show me?" "Tomorrow, when Mason can come too. Both of you need to know." Lily looked at Button. "I knocked the chair over," she said. "I know. I didn't mean to. Accidents don't require meaning, they just require dealing with." Lily was quiet, then carefully. "Are you going to tell Pa?" Sarah considered this with the honesty she applied to everything. "I'm going to tell your father that I showed you and Mason where the drop-off is, so you'll both know where the boundary is. That's what matters." Lily looked at her for a long moment. "You're not like I thought you'd be," she said. "What did you think I'd be like?" "Like Mrs. Harker. She came once and she smelled like lavender and she talked to Pa like me and Mason weren't there." "I see." "She kept calling Pa poor man." Sarah almost smiled. She controlled it. "What did your father think of that?" Lily's expression communicated volumes without a single word. "Right," Sarah said. She stood up and held out her hand. Lily took it, stood up, brushed herself off with the other hand. Button tucked under one arm, the whole operation managed with the particular self-possession of a child who has just cried completely and is now entirely ready to move on. They walked back toward the cabin. Lily's hand was small and firm in hers, and she didn't let go of it until they were on the porch, and Mason appeared in the doorway looking at Lily with the expression of someone who has been standing still inside for too long and did not enjoy it. "You okay?" he asked Lily. "Yes," she said. "You ran east." "I know." "That's toward the—" "I know," Lily said with the authority of someone who has very recently been educated on the matter. "Miss Whitmore told me." Mason looked at Sarah. Something in the look was not quite gratitude. He was too practical for gratitude in the conventional sense. But it was something in the same family. An acknowledgement. A recalibration. "Pa's going to be back soon," he said. "Then let's get supper started," Sarah said, and that was that. She was at the stove and Mason was sitting at the table doing his reading, and Lily was on the floor with Button engaged in a one-sided conversation that Sarah was fairly certain was a detailed account of the afternoon's events when she heard Ethan's horse on the trail. She did not alter anything she was doing. She just continued. He came in through the back. She heard him wash at the basin. She heard his boots on the floor. Then he was in the kitchen doorway, and he stopped the same way he'd stopped this morning, registering the state of things. Supper on the stove. Children present and occupied. Table already set by Lily. The kitchen warmer than he'd probably seen it in some time. "Everything all right?" he said. "Yes," Sarah said. "Mason." "Fine, Pa," Mason said, without looking up from his book. Ethan looked at Lily. Lily looked back at him with her particular careful attention. "Button fell off the shelf," she told him, "and I fell off the chair, but I'm not hurt." Something moved across Ethan's face. He came into the room and crouched down to Lily's level, a movement so automatic and unself-conscious that Sarah thought, there it is, that's where the warmth is. He checked her hands, her arms without a word. Lily submitted to this inspection without protest, which told Sarah it was not unprecedented. "Where?" he said. "Here." Lily showed him a small scrape on her palm that Sarah hadn't seen. Probably from when she'd caught herself on the pine bark. He looked at it. Then he stood up and went to the cabinet and came back with a cloth and cleaned it with the focused economy of someone who had done this before. Lily held still. Mason continued to read. Sarah continued to cook and did not look directly at any of this. Ethan stood. He looked at the shelf where Button apparently lived. He looked at the chair. Then he looked at Sarah's back. "Was she near the east line?" he said. "Not near enough to be in danger," Sarah said. "I went out after her, and tomorrow I'm going to show both of them exactly where the drop-off is, so they know the real boundary." A pause. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'm going to anyway." She turned from the stove and looked at him. Children are safer with information than without it, even when the information is about danger, maybe especially then. He stood in the kitchen and looked at her, and whatever was happening behind his eyes, she couldn't read it. "All right," he said. "The bread is done," she said. "Supper in 10 minutes." He nodded. He walked out. She turned back to the stove. Mason said from the table without looking up from his book, "He looked at you different than Mrs. Harker." "Mason," she said. "Just an observation," he said, the same way he'd said it this morning about the fire. Sarah pressed her lips together and said nothing, and the kitchen smelled like bread, and the fire held, and outside the mountain went dark, the way it did up here completely, and without apology, and she let herself stand in the warmth of what she'd built today, and not think past the edge of it, not yet. But she felt under everything else the first faint and dangerous shape of something she hadn't expected to feel this far from everything she knew. She felt very quietly, like she might be somewhere that needed her. And worse than that, she was beginning to feel like she might need it back. The second week was harder than the first. Not because anything went wrong, but because enough things went right that Sarah stopped bracing for impact every time she turned around, and that kind of lowered guard had its own danger. You stopped watching for the fall, and the fall found you faster. She had a rhythm now. Up before dawn, fire rebuilt water-heated breakfast moving before either child stirred. Mason would appear first, already dressed, already oriented toward usefulness. Lily would come second, slower button under one arm, and her hair in the particular state of chaos that only a 5-year-old sleeping hard could produce. Sarah had started keeping a comb on the kitchen shelf. Every morning, Lily sat in the chair by the stove, and Sarah worked through the tangles while the oats cooked, and neither of them made it into a larger thing than it was. It was just what they did now. Ethan watched this from the doorway the third morning it happened. She felt his eyes on her back, the way you feel, whether not uncomfortable, just present. He didn't say anything. He poured his coffee and went out, and that was the whole of it. But he'd seen it. She knew he'd seen it. The garden was coming back. Slowly, stubbornly, the way things come back when they've had the discipline to survive what was neglected about them. She'd gotten the near beds cleared and turned and replanted with the seed stock she'd found in the dry store. Mason had done 2 rows entirely on his own one afternoon, working with the same systematic focus he applied to everything. And when she'd gone out to check his work, she'd found it nearly perfect. Straight lines, correct depth, nothing wasted. "You've done this before," she said. "Mama used to let me help," he said. He was looking at the row, not her. She knew what she was doing out here. "Yeah." He picked up the trowel and moved to the next section. She knew a lot of things. Sarah let the silence stand. She'd learned that about Mason, he didn't need her to respond to every statement. Sometimes he was just placing things into the air to see if they'd stay there. They usually did. It was the end of that same week when the first real crack appeared. She'd been inside getting the midday meal ready. Lily at the table with a piece of brown paper and a charcoal stick. Sarah had found in the bottom drawer. The child had been drawing for 40 minutes, with the focus of someone conducting serious business. When she heard Mason outside, and then another voice she didn't recognize. She was at the door before she'd thought it through. A man on horseback at the edge of the property. Not threatening in posture, he had the relaxed sit of someone who considered himself welcome everywhere, but large, broad, in the chest, with a look about him that made the back of Sarah's neck register something before her mind caught up. Mason was standing at the fence line. He hadn't moved toward the man. He hadn't moved away. He was just standing the way his father stood when he was deciding something. "Boy," the man said amiably enough, "your daddy home?" "No," Mason said. "Know when he'll be back?" "No." The man smiled. It didn't reach anything past his mouth. "Who's minding the place then?" "I am," Sarah said from the porch. The man looked at her. Took a beat too long doing it. "Well now," he said. "Calloway get himself a wife." "I'm the housekeeper," she said. "Can I help you?" "Can." "Housekeeper." He turned the word over like it was something he'd found on the ground and wasn't sure about. "Hatcher Beaumont. I've got property backing up to Calloway's east line, just being neighborly." "Mr. Calloway's due back this evening," she said. "I'll tell him you came by." "Appreciate it." He didn't move. You been up here long? Long enough, she said. He smiled again the same way, touched his hat brim. Then he turned the horse and went, not hurrying. Mason came back to the porch. He stood next to her and they watched the man go. Do you know him? Sarah asked. He came once before, Mason said. When Pa wasn't home then either. What did he want that time? Pa never said. Mason's jaw had the particular set of his father's jaw. I don't like him. You don't have to, she said. Come inside, she told Ethan that evening. She gave him the name and the description and what was said plainly and completely. He listened without interrupting. Beaumont, he said. He said it the way you say the name of a thing you've been watching out of the corner of your eye for a long time. You know him. I know of him. He's been pushing on the east boundary for 2 years. Says my fence line encroaches on his grazing land. Does it? Ethan looked at her. No. Have you had it surveyed? Not formally. He set down his coffee cup. It's on my list. Move it higher, she said. Men like that, they come when the man of the house isn't there for a reason. Ethan looked at her. You've met men like that before. I grew up in Cutter's Bend, she said. I've met every kind. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll send for the county surveyor next time I'm in town. Good. He picked up his cup, set it down again without drinking. You did right, he said. Staying on the porch. It was not by most measures a significant statement. She filed it carefully in the place where she was keeping all the things that Ethan Calloway said that meant more than their words. The second twist came 8 days later, and it came from a direction she hadn't been watching. Mason got sick. It started as a cough, the kind you hear and dismiss, because children always have coughs, especially in summer when dust was up and they spent their days outside in it. She noted it. She didn't alarm herself. She made him drink more water and kept him from the coldest part of the mornings, and thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't the end of it. By the third day, the cough had moved into his chest and taken up residence there, with the settled intention of something that wasn't planning to leave quickly. By the evening of that day, he had a fever. Not dangerous, she told herself, not yet, but real and climbing. She told Ethan at supper and watched him put his fork down. How high? He said. High enough. She kept her voice even. I've been through the stores. There's willow bark enough for a few days. I need to bring his fever down tonight and keep it down. Ethan pushed back his chair. Where are you going? She said. To check on him. Sit down and finish your supper, she said. I've already checked on him. He's resting. If you go in there now, you'll wake him up, and rest is what he needs. Eat. Then we'll check together. He sat, slowly, like a man overriding something instinctive with something reasoned. They ate in silence for a minute. Lily ate with particular focus, the way she ate when she was processing something she wasn't going to ask about directly. He'll be all right, Sarah said, not to Ethan, but to Lily, because Lily was who needed to hear it. Lily looked up. Promise. Sarah looked at her. She thought about what Ethan had said on the first day, no promises you don't intend to keep. She thought about Mason's voice, she's not coming back. The things not said that stayed there. I'm going to do everything I know how to do, she said. That's what I can promise you, and I know quite a lot. Lily considered this with her full, careful attention. Then she nodded and went back to her supper, apparently satisfied with the honesty of it. After supper, Sarah prepared the willow bark tea and brought it to Mason. He was awake, just barely lying in the tangle of his bedding, with his eyes half open and his face flushed. Ethan came in behind her and stood back, giving her room to work. She helped Mason sit up. He drank the tea without complaint, which told her he felt worse than he was admitting. Tastes bad, he said. Yes, she agreed. Is it supposed to? The things that help usually do. He almost smiled. Not quite. Pa, he said. I'm here, Ethan said from the doorway. The south fence on the lower pasture needs checking. I was going to do it tomorrow, but... "Mason," Ethan said. "Don't. I'll handle it." His voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with irritation. "You sleep." Sarah got Mason resettled, pulled the blanket up, retrieved Button from Lily's doorway where the rabbit had apparently been placed as a medicinal offering. She brought it in and put it on the pillow next to him without comment, and Mason did not comment either. She and Ethan were both in the hall when she pulled Mason's door mostly closed. They stood in the dim hallway, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "He was managing that fence line himself," she said quietly. "He started checking it last spring," Ethan said. His voice was still rough. "I didn't ask him to. He just started doing it. He's 7 years old. I know how old my son is." She looked at him. She could see it on him, not just worry for Mason right now, but something older than that. The accumulated weight of watching a 7-year-old take on the work of someone twice his age because the household needed it done, and Mason was the one who showed up. "He's going to be fine," she said. "The fever is real, but it's not deep yet. I'll sit with him tonight. If it climbs, I'll wake you." "I can sit with him." "You need to be functional tomorrow. I slept well last night. It makes more sense for it to be me." He looked at her in the dark hallway. The argument was logical, and he clearly knew it, and just as clearly didn't like it. "You'd wake me," he said, "if it got worse." "The moment," she said, without hesitation. Something in him settled. "All right." She went back into Mason's room and pulled the chair from the corner to his bedside and settled in. She could hear Ethan on the other side of the wall moving, not settling. She heard him check on Lily. Heard Lily's quiet voice and his quieter response. Heard him go up to the loft. She sat in the dark beside Mason and listened to him breathe and kept one hand within reach of his forehead to track the fever's movement. Around midnight it climbed. She went to the kitchen and rebuilt the fire enough to heat water and made a second dose of the willow bark stronger than the first. She brought it back and woke Mason gently. He drank it without fully waking. His eyes stayed mostly closed. "Miss Whitmore," he said half in a dream. "I'm here," she said. "Don't go away," he said, still half asleep. The words came from somewhere below the controlled surface of the boy who dried dishes and checked fence lines and managed his own mornings. From the part of him that was simply 7 years old and sick in the night and wanted someone to stay. "I'm right here," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He settled. She stayed. The fever broke just before dawn. She felt it happen, the subtle shift in his skin, the fever's peak releasing his breathing, changing from effortful to easier. She put her hand on his forehead and felt the sweat, and felt underneath it the return of something normal. She sat back in the chair and closed her eyes for one moment. When she opened them, Ethan Calloway was standing in the doorway. He'd come down from the loft at some point in the last hour. She didn't know when. He was in his work clothes, which meant he'd dressed already, but he wasn't moving toward the door. He was standing in the doorway of his son's room watching her sit beside the boy. She didn't know how long he'd been there. "Fever broke," she said quietly. He came across the room in 3 steps and put his hand on Mason's forehead. He stood like that for a long moment, with his hand on his son's head, and his back was to her, and she looked at the set of his shoulders, the deliberate, careful way they held themselves, and understood that the emotion on his face was not something he was going to let her see. She stood up quietly. "I'll start breakfast," she said, and she went out. She was at the stove when she heard him, still in Mason's room, say something she wasn't meant to hear. His voice was very low. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was the tone of a man talking to someone sleeping, saying the things that are only safe to say to someone who can't hold you to them. She turned the heat up under the pot and made enough noise with the pan to cover what wasn't hers to hear. Mason was up by mid-morning, irritated by weakness in the specific way of children who have decided they're done being sick before their bodies have agreed. Sarah put him at the kitchen table with a warm drink and his primer, and told him that was the work for today, and he should apply himself to it the way he applied himself to everything, which was entirely, and he did. Lily appeared beside him 20 minutes later with a piece of brown paper and her charcoal, and they sat together, Lily drawing and Mason reading, in a silence that was the most comfortable thing Sarah had witnessed in this house yet. The ordinary miracle of siblings. The particular language of children who have learned they only have each other. Sarah stood at the kitchen window and felt something she was going to have to be very careful about. She was starting to love this house. Not want it, not appreciate it. Love it, the specific and dangerous kind, the kind that made leaving into something with weight and consequence, the kind that sat down inside you and put up curtains without asking permission. She had 4 weeks behind her and 14 months ahead of her, and a contract that ended in a specific conclusion, and she needed to keep those things in the front of her mind, and not let what was happening in this kitchen crowd them out. She turned from the window and started on the midday bread, and did not let herself stand still with it. The twist she hadn't expected came that afternoon when a letter arrived. Not by post. The Ridge didn't get regular post. A rider came up from Cutter's Bend, a boy of maybe 14, who looked exhausted and was clearly relieved to have arrived somewhere with the promise of water. Sarah gave him water and bread, and he gave her a sealed letter addressed to Ethan Calloway, and she brought it inside and set it on the table and told him when he came in at dusk. He looked at the letter for a moment before he picked it up. She watched him read the return address on the envelope. She watched something happen to his face. He put the letter in his chest pocket without opening it. "Who's it from?" Mason asked with the shameless directness of childhood. "Business," Ethan said. "What kind?" Mason, Sarah said, which was all she needed to say, and Mason knew it. But she'd seen the return address. 3 words in a script she didn't know. 2 of them were a place name she didn't recognize. The 3rd word, the last one, was a name. Voss. Voss. She filed it with everything else she was keeping. That evening, after the children were in bed, she was at the kitchen table writing her weekly provision list when Ethan came in from outside. He'd been on the porch for the better part of an hour. She'd heard him out there, the particular quality of stillness that meant he was sitting, not moving. The quality that meant something was working through him that needed space. He came to the table. He stood there for a moment. Then he took the letter from his pocket and set it on the table between them. She looked at it, then up at him. "You don't have to," she said. "It's from Eleanor's father," he said. "Victor Voss. He lives in Colorado Territory now. He heard somehow that I'd brought a woman to the house." He sat down across from her. He put his hands flat on the table. "He's written to inform me that if I intend to install a replacement for his daughter in this household, he will pursue legal claim on Mason and Lily." The kitchen went very quiet. "Can he do that?" Sarah said. "He's a man with money in a territory where money talks. Whether he has legal standing is one question. Whether he has the resources to make things extremely difficult, regardless of standing, is a different question." Sarah sat with this. "He doesn't know who I am. He knows a woman is here. That seems to have been enough to motivate him." "What does he want with Mason and Lily?" Ethan's jaw tightened. Eleanor was his only daughter. The children are his only connection to her. Has he been in contact with them since Eleanor? No. The word was flat and final. He made his feelings about this household very clear when Eleanor left. What he wants now is not the children's well-being. It's something else. Sarah looked at the letter. She looked at Ethan's hands flat and still on the table. A man holding himself down by main force. "He won't take them," she said. He looked up. "I don't know how you'll stop him legally," she said, "and I understand this is not my situation to have strong opinions about. But I know those children. I've sat with Mason through a night fever, and I've held Lily in the dirt under a pine tree, and I'm telling you nobody is taking them anywhere. Not while I'm in this house." The silence that followed that statement was the longest one she'd experienced in his presence. He looked at her with the creekwater eyes, and whatever was working through him stayed below the surface, but she could see the working of it. "You've been here a month," he said. "Yes." "That's a strong position for a month." "Some things don't need longer than a month to be obvious," she said. "Those children are yours, and they belong in this house, and anyone who says otherwise is going to have to make a very good argument to a great number of people starting with me. He picked up the letter, put it back in his pocket, stood up. "I'll write to a lawyer I know in Denver," he said. "Get a proper accounting of where I stand." "Good." He was at the kitchen doorway when she said, "Mr. Calloway." He stopped. "Mason asked me today if I'd still be here for his birthday." She kept her voice even. "It's 2 months out." He turned enough to look at her. "What did you tell him?" "I told him yes." She held his gaze. "I keep the promises I make." Something moved through his face, layered, complicated, not entirely readable. But she saw the bottom of it. She saw what was underneath the calculation, and the control, and the careful management of everything he couldn't afford to need. He nodded once, and walked out. Sarah sat at the table alone. The fire had gone down to a steady, quiet heat. The house around her breathed Mason's slow, even breathing down the hall, Lily's lighter rhythm beside it. The mountain outside doing what it always did, holding everything that happened on it with perfect indifference. She put her hand flat on the table, where Ethan's had been. Still warm. She took her hand away. She picked up her provision list. She added 3 things she'd forgotten, and underneath, everything. Underneath the practicality and the list and the firelight and the steady sound of children sleeping, she felt it again. That shape she'd first noticed a week ago, the one she was trying not to look at directly. It was bigger now. She was going to have to do something about that. She just hadn't decided what yet. Down the hall, Lily made a small sound in her sleep. Not the tight, careful crying. Something different. Something easier. Sarah listened until it stopped. Then she blew out the lamp and went to bed. And for the first time since she'd come up to Red Hollow Ridge, she slept completely through the night. The lawyer's letter came back from Denver in 11 days. Sarah knew it had arrived because Ethan read it at the kitchen table before dawn, when he thought everyone was still asleep, and when she came down the stairs, she found him sitting there with the paper in his hand, and a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled stillness. Something underneath that. Something that had gotten past the control while he wasn't watching. He folded the letter when he heard her on the stairs. But not fast enough. She put the coffee on without saying anything. She put a cup in front of him. She sat down across from him and waited. He looked at the folded paper, then at her. "Victor Voss filed a petition in Colorado Territory 3 weeks ago," he said. "Before he even sent me the letter. He filed first and notified me second." She kept her voice steady. "What kind of petition?" "Guardianship. On grounds of parental abandonment, Eleanor's leaving, and what he's calling an unstable household situation." He set the paper flat on the table. "The lawyer says the petition has limited merit under Wyoming territorial law, but Voss has resources, and Wyoming and Colorado have a complicated jurisdictional relationship. It could take months to resolve, possibly longer. What does he need from you to fight it?" "Documentation. Proof of stable household. School records for Mason which don't exist because Mason hasn't been to school since Eleanor left. Character witnesses from the community, which is complicated because I haven't exactly cultivated relationships in Cutter's Bend." She absorbed all of this. "The county surveyor," she said, "for the east boundary dispute with Beaumont." He looked at her. "What about him? Get him up here to do the survey, and while he's here have him document the property and the household. Official record, dated. Hard to argue with a county document." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a good thought. Mason needs to be in school by fall term. That's 2 months. What's in Cutter's Bend for schooling?" "There's a schoolhouse, teacher named Aldrich. Then Mason goes, starting fall term." She looked at him. "And you need to be seen in town, not hiding up here. A man who comes to town, pays his accounts, is known by his neighbors. That's a different picture than what Voss is painting." "I don't—" He stopped. "Like town," she finished. "I know. Do it anyway." He looked at her with an expression she was learning to read, the one that happened when she said something he agreed with that he hadn't expected to agree with. "There's one more thing," he said. He picked up the letter and looked at it without opening it again. Voss's petition includes a statement from Eleanor. The kitchen went very still. She's alive, Sarah said. Yes. He set the letter down. She's in Colorado, living with her father. She signed a statement supporting his petition. He said it flatly, the way you say things that have passed through pain and come out the other side as pure information. She says the household is not fit for children. She says I was difficult, cold, unable to provide emotional stability. Sarah sat with that for a long moment. She looked at this man across the table, the man who had cleaned his daughter's scrape without a word, who had sat in Mason's doorway, saying things to a sleeping child that he couldn't say in daylight, who had come down from the loft in the middle of a fever night to stand in a doorway and watch her and not said a single word about it. She's wrong, Sarah said. He looked up. She may have her reasons for leaving. I'm not in a position to judge that, and I'm not going to. But she's wrong about what's in this house. She held his gaze. And I'll say so to anyone who asks. Officially in writing, whatever form is useful. I've been here 6 weeks. I know what I've seen. Something moved across his face that she didn't have a name for yet. You're contracted help, he said. Not cruelly, just precisely. A lawyer for Voss will point that out. Then let him point it out, she said. The truth of what I've seen doesn't change based on the reason I'm here. He stood up. He picked up the letter. He stood there for a moment with it in his hand, and she could see him doing what he always did, taking something large and painful and finding the precise place in his chest to put it where it wouldn't interfere with the work that needed doing. I'll write to the lawyer today, he said, and I'll get word to the county surveyor. Good. He put his hat on. He went out. She heard the horse on the trail heading down toward Cutter's Bend, and she sat at the table for a moment longer and felt the weight of what was sitting in this house. The petition, the letter, Eleanor's name hanging in the air of the kitchen like smoke that wouldn't clear. And then she stood up and got breakfast started because Mason and Lily were going to be up in 20 minutes and they needed feeding. That was how you dealt with large things. You made breakfast. Mason noticed something was different that morning. He noticed most things she'd come to understand that about him. He had his father's observational precision without his father's poker face. Pa left early, he said. He had business in town. What kind? The kind that needs attending to. She set his oats down. Eat. He ate. But he was watching her with the watchful assessment that meant he was going to come back to it. Lily was drawing again. She'd filled both sides of every piece of brown paper Sarah had given her, and had moved on to a set of smooth boards she'd found in the woodpile, drawing on the pale surfaces with her charcoal with complete absorption. This morning's board showed 3 figures, tall, medium, small, side by side. Sarah had seen it upside down from across the table and had looked away before she could be caught looking. Miss Whitmore, Lily said without looking up from her board. Yes. Are we going to have to go away? Mason's spoon stopped. Sarah turned from the stove. She looked at Lily, who was still drawing her charcoal, moving in small, careful strokes. 5 years old, with ears like a hawk, and a mind that connected things adults thought they were keeping separate. No, Sarah said. Lily looked up. Promise. She thought about the lawyer's letter, about Victor Voss in Colorado territory with his money and his petition and his daughter's signed statement. Yes, she said. Mason looked at her. She met his eyes. He was doing the calculation. She could see it, the weighing of her word against every other piece of evidence available to him. Okay, he said finally, and went back to his oats. She turned back to the stove. Her hands were steady. Everything else underneath them was not. Ethan came back from town at midday instead of dusk, which was the first sign that something had changed. He came in fast, not running. Ethan Calloway didn't run, but moving with the particular compressed energy of a man who had learned something and hadn't finished processing it. He looked for her immediately. Found her in the kitchen. Beaumont's been talking in town, he said without preamble. She turned from the counter. Talking about what? About this property, about the East Line. He's been telling people in Cutter's Bend that I've been running cattle over his grazing land for 2 seasons, and he's got witnesses. He took his hat off and set it on the table. He doesn't have witnesses. He has men he's paid to say they're witnesses, which amounts to the same practical problem. Beaumont and Voss, she said. Do they know each other? Ethan went very still. She watched the connection land on him. Think about the timing, she said. Voss files his petition. 3 weeks later, Beaumont starts talking in town. You're being pressured from 2 directions at once. He stood at the table and worked through it, and she could see the moment it assembled into a complete picture. They know each other, he said, or they found each other. A man who wants this property and a man who wants these children, those 2 problems could be useful to each other. She kept her voice level. If Voss wins the guardianship petition, you've got no reason to stay on this property. If Beaumont wins his land claim, you've got no viable property to stay on. Either way, they get what they want. Ethan sat down. He put his hands flat on the table, the same thing he'd done with Eleanor's letter, and looked at the grain of the wood. I should have dealt with Beaumont 2 years ago, he said. You were managing other things. That's not an excuse. It's not an excuse, it's a fact. She sat down across from him. You can't fight both of these from up here. You need to be visible cooperative with county authorities, and you need that survey done before Beaumont gets to file anything official. The surveyor can come Thursday, he said. I arranged it this morning. Good. What about a lawyer for the guardianship case? Man named Alderton in Cutter's Bend. Not as experienced as I'd like, but he knows the territorial judges. Have him document everything. The household, the children's condition, the garden, the provisions. Everything that shows this is a functioning stable home. He looked at her across the table. You've thought about this more than I have. I've had more time to think today, she said. You've been riding. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, she'd never seen him fully smile, but an adjustment in that direction. I'll meet with Alderton tomorrow morning, he said. I'll write down what I've observed since I arrived. Specific dates, specific incidents. It'll be more useful than general statements. She met his eyes. If you want it. He looked at her. I want it, he said. The surveyor came Thursday and spent 4 hours on the property. Sarah made him lunch and answered his questions about the household directly and without embellishment. He was a spare, efficient man named Garrett, who wrote everything down in a small leather notebook and seemed unimpressed by anything except the garden, which he complimented with genuine surprise. Didn't expect to see a working kitchen garden up here, he said. It was here when I arrived, Sarah said. It needed some attention. Garrett looked at the neat rows, the replanted beds, the evidence of recent and sustained labor. Calloway's got a good piece of land, he said to nobody in particular. Better than Beaumont deserves to get his hands on. She looked at him. Is that your professional opinion? Garrett smiled for the first time. It's my personal one, he said. The professional one will say the east fence line is exactly where it should be and has been since the property was filed in 1871. He closed his notebook. That ought to help your situation, ma'am. It ought to, she agreed. When she told Ethan that evening what Garrett had said, she watched something in him ease just fractionally, just enough to be visible. One problem addressed, he said. One at a time, she said. He looked at her across the table in the evening quiet. Mason already in bed. Lily asleep over her drawing board, the fire down to its working heat, and he said, Sarah. It was the first time he'd used her name, not Miss Whitmore, not a general address. Her name plain said with the same directness he applied to everything, but with something underneath it that she felt in her chest before she processed it in her mind. Yes, she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. Why are you doing this? He said. The lawyer strategy. Thinking through Beaumont and Voss. Writing testimony for Alderton. That's beyond what the contract requires. She looked at him. She thought about the truthful answer, which was complicated, and the simple answer, which was also true. Mason told me to stay for his birthday, she said. I told him I would. Whatever makes that possible is what I'm going to do. He was quiet for a long moment. "The contract," he said. "The 18 months. What about it?" He looked at his hands, then at her. "It's not I need you to know that I don't think of you as—" He stopped. Started again with the precision of a man who has learned that imprecise words cost him things he can't afford to lose. "The arrangement Harold Finch described the way it was presented to you, that's not what I intended." "I know," she said. "You said at the start that you weren't property." "I did. You weren't wrong." The fire settled. Outside, the mountain wind had picked up, pressing against the cabin walls with the particular insistence of summer storms that hadn't quite committed yet. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Ethan," he said. She met his eyes. Ethan. The name sat differently than she'd expected. More natural. More dangerous. "I know what you intended. And I know what this has been. They're not the same thing they were when I got off that horse." He held her gaze. "No," he said. "They're not." The storm that had been threatening committed itself the next morning. She heard it before she was fully awake, a sound like the mountain clearing its throat, low and enormous and inevitable. Then the rain hit the roof like a decision, all at once, no preliminary. She was downstairs in 3 minutes. The fire was out, a gust through the chimney had killed it in the night, and the kitchen was cold in a way that had weight to it. She rebuilt the fire. Mason appeared behind her without being called. "Big one," he said, listening to the rain. "Yes." "Pa's going to lose a day on the south fence repair." "He'll manage." She handed him the bellows. "Keep the fire encouraged. I'll check the water situation." The rain was the kind that made the world outside the cabin disappear. She stood in the doorway for a moment and could see nothing past the porch rail except gray moving water. The garden was going to take a beating. The trail down to Cutter's Bend would be mud soup by noon. They were for practical purposes stranded. She found this less alarming than she would have found it 6 weeks ago. She went back inside and made breakfast, and the 4 of them, Ethan had come down from the loft with the same alert expression as his son, already thinking about what the weather cost them, sat at the table and ate while the storm said what it had to say to the roof. "We're not going anywhere today," Ethan said. "No," Sarah agreed. "The south fence." "We'll wait," she said. "It's been standing this long." He looked at her. She looked back. Mason between them tracked this exchange with the expression of a spectator at a chess match who has figured out 3 moves ahead where it's going. Lily said, "Can we play a game?" Everyone looked at her. She looked back with the perfect composure of a 5-year-old who has decided that a storm day is a storm day and there's no point being grim about it. "What game?" Mason said. "The one with the cards." "Pa knows it." Ethan looked at Lily with the expression he only had for her, the one where the control went soft at the edges. "I know it," he said. "Then play," Lily said. They played cards at the kitchen table while the storm worked through its considerable feelings outside. Ethan knew a game that involved complex rules. He explained once and then enforced without mercy, which meant Mason learned them in 2 rounds out of competitive necessity, and Lily learned them in 4 rounds, because she kept changing the rules when they didn't suit her, which Ethan permitted with a straightness of face that Sarah recognized as a very controlled form of delight. She watched him with his children at that table, and felt the thing in her chest that she had been managing carefully, practically with great discipline, threatened to become unmanageable. She looked away. She refilled the coffee cups. She kept her hands busy. The morning passed. The rain did not. By afternoon, it had settled into a lower register, still determined, but no longer declarative. Ethan went out to check the outbuildings which needed it, and came back soaked and tracking mud, and went to change without being asked, which she noted, because she'd left dry clothes folded on the trunk at the base of the loft stairs that morning, and he'd taken them without comment, and she'd said nothing. But something in that small exchange felt like a language developing between them that neither of them had named yet. Mason had fallen asleep on the bench with his primer on his chest, which was the most purely childlike thing she'd seen him do, and she'd covered him with a blanket and left him there. Lily was at the table with her boards drawing. Sarah sat across from her and was mending one of Mason's shirts the elbow had gone through when Lily looked up. "Miss Whitmore," she said. Are you going to marry Papa?" The needle went sideways. Sarah controlled her hand before it did anything more dramatic. "Lily," she said. "Mason says you're not, but I think you might be." Lily looked back at her board with the serenity of someone who has lodged an opinion and is content to let it sit. "You look at him like Mrs. Porter looks at Mr. Porter." "I've never met the Porters," Sarah said very carefully. "We saw them in town once, before." Lily drew a careful line. She looked at him like he was the most interesting thing in the room, even when he was just standing there. She looked up again. "You do that." "I do not." Sarah stopped, started again. "Lily, your father and I have an arrangement, a working arrangement. It's not—" "He looks at you too," Lily said with the devastating certainty of a 5-year-old who has decided she is reporting facts and not opinions. "When you're not looking at him, he looks at you like he's trying to figure something out." Sarah opened her mouth, closed it. Lily went back to her drawing. "Just so you know," she said pleasantly. Sarah looked down at Mason's shirt in her hands and applied herself to the elbow with great concentration for a long moment. When Ethan came back in from outside, changed dry moving through the kitchen to check the stove, she did not look at him directly. She was extremely focused on the shirt. He stopped at the table, looked at Lily's board. "What is that?" he said. "Our house," Lily said. "And us." "Who's that?" He pointed. "Miss Whitmore." Lily pointed to the tallest figure on the board. "That's you. That's Mason. That's me. And Button." She pointed to a small shape beside the shortest figure. Ethan stood looking at the board for a moment. The 4 figures in charcoal on pale wood, side by side in a row in front of a house with lines coming from the chimney that Lily intended as smoke. "It's good," he said. His voice was slightly rougher than usual. "I know," Lily said. He looked up and his eyes met Sarah's across the table. She had been looking despite her best intentions. She did not look away fast enough. He didn't look away either. The moment held for 1 beat too long to be incidental. Then Mason shifted on the bench in his sleep and knocked his primer to the floor, and the spell broke, and she looked back at the shirt, and he went to pick up the primer and set it on the table, and the kitchen continued, and the rain continued, and nothing was said. But it had been there. They'd both been in it. And there was no unknowing that. That evening after supper, a meal that had been quieter than usual, charged in a way the children either didn't notice or had the good grace not to comment on. She was washing the dishes when she felt him behind her. Not close. Just present the way he was sometimes present, filling a doorway or standing at the edge of a room, as though he hadn't fully decided to enter it. "The letter I need to write for Alderton," he said. "The character statement. I'm not good with that kind of language." She kept her hands in the basin. "What kind of language?" "The kind that says what something is without sounding like you're arguing for it." He came into the kitchen properly. She heard him at the table sitting. "If I write it, it'll sound like a legal brief. Alderton said it needs to sound like a person." "Then let it sound like a person," she said. "I'm asking if you'd look at it." She turned. He had a piece of paper and a pen in front of him, and he was looking at them with the expression of a man facing something he found genuinely difficult. Not the fence line, not the east boundary. This, the language of feeling the vocabulary of what a home was. "Write it first," she said. "Then I'll look." He wrote for 20 minutes. She finished the dishes and dried her hands and sat at the opposite end of the table with her own mending and didn't watch him because watching him would have made it harder for him. When he slid the paper across the table, she read it. It was exactly what he'd said, precise, factual, structured like an argument rather than a testimony. It said the right things in the wrong register. It was the voice of a man who had spent 2 years building walls around everything that mattered, and had then been asked to show you the inside of the walls. She took the pen. She didn't rewrite it. She made small adjustments, moving a phrase. here changing a word there, opening a sentence that he'd closed too quickly. She gave it back. He read it again. "That's what I meant," he said, quiet, a little rough. "I know," she said. He looked at her across the table. The lamp was between them, and the light it made was the warm, imprecise light of lamplight. And she was looking at him, and he was looking at her, and the space between them had been shrinking for 6 weeks and was currently very small, and neither of them was doing anything about it. "Sarah," he said. "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Not tonight," she said. Her voice was steady, and she was grateful for it. "Not with the storm and the letter, and not tonight. Whatever you're going to say, it will keep until morning." He sat with that. She watched him decide whether to argue it and decide not to. "All right," he said. "Good night," she said. She pushed her chair back. She took her mending. She walked to the stairs. "Sarah." She stopped. Her back was to him. "Thank you," he said. "For today. For all of it." She stood at the bottom of the stairs and felt the full weight of what 6 weeks had built, and the full complicated fear of what that weight meant with 12 months of contract still ahead and a man she hadn't expected behind her and a house she hadn't chosen that had somehow chosen her. "You're welcome," she said. She went up to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs and breathed. Down the hall she could hear Lily talking to Button in the specific low murmur of a child settling herself to sleep. She could hear the rain lighter now easing. She could hear below her the particular sound of Ethan Calloway sitting alone at the kitchen table for a long time before she finally heard his boots on the floor and the creak of the loft ladder. She lay down, stared at the ceiling, said to herself, clearly and precisely, all the reasons this was complicated and all the reasons she needed to keep her head. Then, underneath all of those reasons, she let herself feel for exactly one unguarded minute what was actually true. Then she closed her eyes and did not sleep for a very long time. The morning after the storm, Ethan said nothing about the night before, neither did she. They moved around the kitchen with the careful precision of two people who have acknowledged something without words and have agreed without discussion to let it sit until they know what to do with it. He poured his coffee. She made the oats. Mason came down and assessed the silence between the adults with his usual accuracy and said nothing. Lily came down and looked at both of them and looked at Mason and apparently concluded from Mason's expression that the correct response was also silence, which was the most disciplined thing Sarah had ever seen a 5-year-old do. They ate. Ethan went out. The day began. But something had shifted in the architecture of the house, and they all felt it, and nobody said so, and that was its own kind of language. The letter from Alderton came 4 days later. Sarah was in the garden when Mason ran it out to her still sealed, addressed to Ethan, who was on the property somewhere. She held it and looked at the return address and felt the weight of it. "Do you know what it is?" Mason asked. "I think so," she said. "Go find your father." He ran. She stood in the garden with the letter and waited. Ethan came fast when Mason found him. She could tell by the pace of his boots on the ground. He took the letter from her, opened it standing right there between the garden rows, and read it. She watched his face. He read it twice. Then he lowered it. "The survey came through official record," he said. "County has it filed. Beaumont's claim has no legal standing." He looked at the letter again. "And Alderton submitted the household documentation to the territorial court in Cheyenne. The judge reviewing Voss's petition has requested a delay pending full review." She breathed. "That's good." "It's not over," he said. "Voss will push back." "He can push," she said. "It's harder to push something that's properly anchored." He looked at her. The morning light was full and direct, and neither of them was hiding from it. "Alderton included your testimony," he said. "Your written account." He said the judge specifically noted it. She kept her voice even. "I meant every word of it." "I know you did." He folded the letter. "That's why it worked. Mason was standing at the garden's edge, watching both of them with his chin up and his hands in his pockets, trying very hard to look like someone who wasn't tracking every word. "Well," he said finally. "We're all right," Ethan said. Mason's shoulders came down about an inch. He nodded like this confirmed something he'd suspected. Then he turned and went back to the woodpile he'd been working at, because Mason Calloway expressed relief the same way he expressed everything else, by finding something useful to do with it. The second week after the storm, Victor Voss arrived in Cutter's Bend. Ethan heard it from the liveryman when he went for supplies. A man matching Voss's description had come in on the stage from Colorado, checked into the only boarding house in town, and had been seen that same afternoon going into Alderton's office. Not requesting a meeting, demanding one. Ethan told Sarah that evening, after the children were in bed at the kitchen table, with the same directness he'd been bringing to everything since the storm. She'd noticed that. The storm had dissolved something between them, not the careful management, but the distance that had lived inside it. "He's here," she said. "Yes, that means he's scared," she said. Men with legitimate cases don't come in person to intimidate the other side's lawyer. They let the law work. He came because he doesn't trust the law to work in his favor. Ethan looked at her. "You're very good at reading men like this." "I grew up watching Harold Finch operate," she said. "The methods are the same regardless of scale. Pressure presents implied consequences. It works on people who are afraid." She met his eyes. "Are you afraid?" He was quiet for a moment. "Of losing Mason and Lily?" "Yes." "Good," she said. "Fear in the right direction is useful. Are you afraid of Voss himself?" "No." "Then go to town tomorrow," she said. "Not to confront him, just to be seen. At the bank, at the general store, at Alderton's office. A man who is comfortable in his community going about his business. That's the picture you want." He looked at her for a long moment. "Come with me," he said. She went still. "What?" "To town. Come with me." He said it plainly, the way he said things when he'd already thought them through. Voss's argument is an unstable household. Walking into Cutter's Bend alone undermines that less than walking in as a household. She understood the logic. She also understood that it wasn't only logic. "All right," she said. They left Mason and Lily with the nearest neighbor, a woman named Ruth Hensley, who lived 2 miles south and Sarah had discovered been keeping a quiet eye on the Calloway property for 2 years, out of the kind of practical, neighborly concern that doesn't announce itself. Ruth arrived without fanfare, took one look at the state of the garden, and complimented it with the specific warmth of someone recognizing their own care being continued. The ride down to Cutter's Bend was the same 4 hours as the first time, but nothing else about it was the same. She didn't hold the back of the saddle. She didn't put the maximum distance between herself and Ethan that the horse's width allowed. She rode behind him with her hands at his sides, and they talked not constantly, not performed conversation, but the real kind that happened between people who had run out of reasons to be careful with each other. He told her about how he'd come to Red Hollow Ridge. Not the short version farther west suited him, but the real one. He'd been a cattle hand in Nevada for 6 years, working other men's land and other men's cattle, and there'd been a point where he'd looked up and understood that he was going to spend his whole life doing that, unless he did something different. He'd saved for 4 years. He'd found the ridge property through a land agent in Cheyenne. He'd built the cabin himself, mostly with 2 hired men for the heavy work. He'd brought Eleanor up here believing she'd understood what it was. She hadn't, he said. "No," Sarah said. She thought she had. She wasn't lying when she came up here. She genuinely believed she could make peace with the isolation. He was quiet for a stride or two. But belief and reality are different things, and I knew that gap was there by the end of the first year, and I didn't do enough about it. You blame yourself. I blame the situation. I contributed to the situation. That's honest. She held that. Then, what would you have done differently? He thought about it for long enough that she respected the answer before it came. Listened more, he said. I'm good at managing things. I'm less good at listening to people who are struggling with things I can't manage. That's an honest accounting, she said. It's taken me 2 years to get there. They rode. The trail opened up and the valley came into view below them, the town small and human-scaled against the enormous indifference of the land. Sarah, he said. Yes. When the contract is done. He stopped. She felt the steadiness of his breathing through her hands at his sides. 18 months. When it's done. Ethan. I'm not asking you to decide anything, he said. I just need to say it. When the 18 months are done, I'm going to ask you to stay. Not because of the children. Not because of the house. Because of... He stopped. Started with different words. Because of what this is. Whatever this is. She sat behind him on that horse, and felt the full consequence of what she'd been keeping careful management of for 2 months hit her without any management at all. Ask me then, she said. Her voice was almost entirely steady. When the time comes, ask me then. That's not a no, he said. No, she said. It isn't. He didn't say anything else, neither did she. But his posture in the saddle changed in some way she couldn't precisely name something in it that had been held released just enough. They rode down into Cutter's Bend, side by side, on the wide part of the trail. Cutter's Bend looked at them. That was the only accurate way to describe it. The town had the small-town awareness of everything that moved through it, and 2 people on a horse coming down from the ridge was not something it missed. She felt the attention from the general store porch, from the window of the boarding house, from the man standing outside the barber shop, who was not, as far as she could tell, getting a haircut. She sat up straight. She did not look away from anything. Ethan went to the bank first. She waited with the horse and watched the street and felt rather than saw the moment Victor Voss walked out of the boarding house. He was a tall man, well dressed in the way of men who use clothing to communicate authority. Silver-haired, carried himself like someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves when he entered. He came down the boarding house steps and saw her and stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. His expression was doing the calculation who she was, what her presence meant, how to adjust. She did not help him adjust. She held his gaze and said nothing, and let him stand in the discomfort of being looked at directly by someone who wasn't afraid of him. He walked toward her. You'd be the housekeeper, he said. Not a question. I'd be Sarah Whitmore, she said. You'd be Victor Voss. He blinked. She'd used his information before he could use hers. Small thing. Mattered. My grandchildren are up on that ridge, he said. Your grandchildren are thriving on that ridge, she said. Mason is reading 2 years ahead of his age. Lily is the most observant child I've ever met. They're healthy and fed and loved. That's what you'd see if you went up there, which you're welcome to do. He looked at her, reassessing. My daughter made her choices, Sarah said. Her children made none of them. They didn't choose to lose their mother. They didn't choose to spend 2 years without a woman in the house. They didn't choose any of this. What they have now is a stable home, with a father who loves them and works himself to the bone for them every single day, and that is what the territorial court is going to see when it looks at the evidence. Voss's jaw tightened. You're remarkably confident for someone in a contracted position. I'm remarkably clear, she said. There's a difference. I've got nothing to be afraid of in this conversation, because everything I've said is true and documented and submitted to a judge in Cheyenne. She held his gaze. Can you say the same? The street had gone somewhat quiet around them. She was aware of it. She didn't break eye contact. Victor Voss stood in the middle of the street of Cutter's Bend and looked at this 26-year-old woman on a horse and did the calculation that men like him always did, the assessment of whether they were dealing with someone who could be moved. She showed him as plainly as she knew how that she could not. Ethan came out of the bank. He saw Voss. He walked over without hurrying. The 2 men looked at each other. She felt the history in that look, the weight of Eleanor between them. The children, 2 years of distance and grievance and complicated grief. Victor, Ethan said. Calloway. Voss looked at him. Something crossed the older man's face, something that wasn't entirely a weapon. Something that might have been underneath everything else: a father who had lost his daughter and was doing what grief told him to do, even when what grief told him was wrong. I want to see them. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Come up Thursday, he said. I'll have Ruth Hensley there. Neutral party. You can spend the afternoon. Voss blinked. He'd expected resistance. He'd prepared for resistance. The offer caught him off balance in the specific way that decency sometimes catches people who are braced for a fight. That's yes, he said. Thursday. Alderton will note it, Ethan said. That you came and that you were welcomed. He held the man's gaze. I'm not your enemy, Victor. I never was. Eleanor leaving didn't make me that. Voss looked at him for a long moment. Something in the older man shifted. Not collapsed. Not surrendered, but moved. The petition wasn't over. But something in the man driving it had changed. He nodded once, turned, walked back toward the boarding house. Sarah let out a breath. Ethan came to stand beside the horse. He looked at her. What did you say to him? The truth, she said, loudly. He almost smiled. There it was, the real version, edges and everything. She'd been waiting 2 months for that, and it was worth every one of them. Let's go to Alderton's, he said. Tell him about Thursday. They went. Victor Voss came on Thursday. Ruth Hensley was there, practical and warm, and clearly prepared to document the occasion in her own memory with great accuracy. Mason met his grandfather at the fence line with the wary assessment of someone who had been told the visit was happening and had prepared himself for it with characteristic thoroughness. Lily stayed on the porch and held button and watched. Voss crouched down to Mason's level. Something he hadn't expected to need to do. She could tell the movement was effortful, not instinctive. You look like your mother, Voss said. People say that, Mason said. She had your eyes. I know. Mason studied him. She's not coming back, is she? Voss flinched, just barely. No, son. She's not. Okay, Mason said. The same way he'd said it to Sarah 2 months ago. The same breath out. The same small settling. Do you want to see the garden Miss Whitmore fixed it? He looked up at Sarah. She kept her expression still. I'd like that, Voss said. Mason took his grandfather through the garden with the tour guide authority of someone who had participated in its restoration and felt entitled to present it. He named what was planted and where and why. He showed the replanted beds and the straight rows he'd done himself. Voss walked beside him and listened, and didn't say much, and she watched the old man's face and saw something happening in it that the petition hadn't prepared for. He was seeing what was actually there. Lily came off the porch eventually. Not quickly. Lily never did anything quickly when strangers were involved. But she came, and she stood near Sarah, and at some point, Voss crouched down to her level the same way he had for Mason, and Lily showed him button without being asked which was the highest honor she gave. Did you make him? Voss asked. Mama made him, Lily said. But Mason fixed his ear. Voss looked at the rabbit's ear, at the crooked stitch. He looked at it for a long time. When he stood up, his eyes were not entirely dry. He was a man who didn't allow himself to show that in public, and she respected the effort, even as she registered the fact. He stayed 3 hours. He ate the lunch she'd made at the kitchen table with his grandchildren and with Ethan, and the conversation was not easy and was not pretend, but it was real, and real was something she had learned to value over every other quality. When he left, he paused at the fence line and turned back. Miss Whitmore, he said. She came to the porch rail. Eleanor. He stopped, started differently. My daughter made her choices, and she has to live with them. These children didn't choose anything. I want you to know that I understand that now. She looked at him. What are you going to do about the petition? He looked at the house, at the garden, at Mason, who had already gone back to checking the fence line because he was 7 and the fence needed checking. I'll speak to my lawyer, he said. It was not a withdrawal, but it was a door opening where a wall had been. You're welcome back, she said. Whenever you want to see them. He nodded. He left. Ruth Hensley, departing shortly after, pressed Sarah's hand at the door and said, "You did good, girl," with the specific warmth of a woman who has watched a lot of things and knows what good looks like. Sarah held on to that for the rest of the day. The letter from Cheyenne came 3 weeks later. The territorial court had reviewed the petition and found insufficient grounds to proceed under Wyoming law. Victor Voss's claim was dismissed without prejudice, meaning he could refile, but the current case was closed. The survey documentation, the household testimony, the dated records, all of it had done exactly what it was supposed to do. Ethan read the letter at the kitchen table in the morning. He set it down. He looked at it. Then he looked at Sarah. "It's done," he said. She sat down across from him. She looked at the letter. She felt something she hadn't expected, not just relief, but a kind of grief underneath it. The crisis had been the shape their closeness had been built around, the urgent common purpose that had made it safe to be in each other's orbit. With it resolved, the space was different. More open. More honest. More frightening. "It's done," she said. Mason appeared in the doorway, reading them both in 3 seconds. "Is it good news?" "Yes," Ethan said. Mason walked to his father and put his hand briefly on his father's shoulder, a gesture so adult and so genuine that it stopped the room, and then he walked to the bread box and cut himself a piece, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. Lily appeared behind where Mason had been. She looked at her father. She looked at Sarah. "Are we happy?" she said. "Yes," Sarah said. "We're happy." Lily nodded. She climbed into her chair at the table and picked up her charcoal board. She drew a sun in the corner of it, large and definitive. She showed it to Sarah. "For today," she said. "For today," Sarah agreed. The weeks that followed were the quietest in Sarah's memory. Not empty quiet, the full quiet of a household that has survived something and come out the other side into something that works. She baked bread and tended the garden and sat with Mason over his primer in the evenings before the fall term began and taught him things Aldrich's schoolroom would build on. She sat with Lily in the afternoons, and the child talked more, now full sentences, questions she'd been holding for months, observations about everything she'd been cataloging in silence. Ethan came in from the day's work and washed at the basin and sat at the table, and the 4 of them ate supper, and the fire held, and the mountain outside did what it always did, which was everything and nothing, enormous and indifferent. And none of that mattered, because inside the cabin something had been built that the mountain couldn't touch. She did not let herself forget the contract. 12 months remaining, then 11, then 10. She kept the number in the front of her mind because it was honest, and she'd promised herself honesty from the beginning about everything, including the things that frightened her. What frightened her most was how little the number mattered anymore. The moment it broke open happened on an ordinary evening in late summer, when the heat had finally begun to soften at the edges and the light was going golden and long. She was on the porch with the mending when Ethan came out and sat on the bench beside her. Not across the porch, not at the railing, but on the same bench, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. She kept her hands on the mending. "I heard from Alderton today," he said. "What did he say?" "Voss has been in contact, through his lawyer." He looked at his hands. "He wants visiting rights. Formal, scheduled, nothing adversarial." She looked up. That's good." "It's what the children deserve," he said. "Whatever else, he's their grandfather. I should have offered it before he felt like he had to fight for it." "You were protecting them." "I was protecting myself," he said. Quietly, precisely. "I thought if I kept everything tight enough, nothing else would leave." He paused. "That's not the same thing." She set the mending down. She looked at him. "Ethan," she said. "I know," he said. "I said I'd wait until the contract was done. I'm going to keep that." "You said you'd ask me then," she said. "I didn't say anything about waiting." He turned to look at her. The evening light was full on his face, and she could see all of it, every part of the 2 years before she arrived, and the 2 months since the grief and the work, and the slow, difficult process of a man learning to let something in that he'd decided to live without. "Then don't wait," she said. "Sarah, I came up here because I had no other choice," she said. "I know that, you know that. That's the truth of where it started." She held his gaze. "But that's not the truth of where it is. And I need to say that out loud in daylight without a fever or a storm or a crisis making it easy. I need to say it plainly." She put her hand on the bench between them. "I don't want to leave. Not at the end of 12 months. Not at the end of 18. I don't want to leave this house or these children or—" She stopped, said it. "Or you." He looked at her hand on the bench. He put his hand over it. "I'm not easy," he said. "I know. I'm not good with words when it matters. You're better than you think. I'll probably do it wrong more than I do it right." "Ethan," she said, "I spent 6 weeks watching you rebuild something you thought was finished. You did it one day at a time with no guarantee it would hold. I know what you're capable of." His hand tightened over hers. He looked at her with the creek water eyes, and everything in them was visible for once. No management, no control, just what was there. "Stay," he said. "Not the contract. Not 18 months. Stay." "Yes," she said. Inside the cabin, they heard Lily say something to Mason in the specific tone she used when she had a theory she was confident in. They heard Mason's response, which was short and dismissive. They heard Lily repeat herself with greater emphasis. Sarah looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Sarah. They both got up and went inside. Mason was at the table with his primer. Lily was standing in the middle of the room holding Button and her charcoal board with an expression of supreme vindication. "I told you," Lily said to Mason. "You told me what Sarah said." Lily held up the board. The drawing she'd done weeks ago, the 4 figures side by side in front of the house with the smoke coming from the chimney. She pointed to the 2 tallest ones. "I told him you'd stay," Lily said. "He said you might not. I said you would." She looked at her father and then at Sarah with the absolute certainty of a 5-year-old who has understood something long before the adults did. I could tell. Mason looked at his primer, then at the ceiling. Then at Sarah with the expression of a boy conceding a point he'd never actually doubted. "Fine," he said. "You were right." "I know," Lily said with perfect serenity. She put Button on the table. She climbed into her chair. She looked at her board and added 2 more lines to the smoke coming from the chimney, thicker now, fuller, more permanent. Ethan put his hand briefly at the back of Sarah's neck, light, deliberate, the gesture of a man who has stopped rehearsing things before he does them. Then he pulled out his chair and sat at the table, and Sarah sat across from him, and Mason read his primer, and Lily drew her smoke, and the fire held. And the evening came down over Red Hollow Ridge the way evenings do when a house has finally become what it was always supposed to be. She had come to this mountain without a choice. She was staying by choice. And there was not 1 inch of difference in the end between arriving and belonging, only the time it takes a person to recognize the place that was always meant to hold them. That was where Sarah Whitmore's story ended. Not with a declaration, not with ceremony, not with anyone watching or recording or bearing witness, except 4 people around a kitchen table and a fire that had learned by now to hold through the night without being asked. It ended the only way real things end, quietly, completely, and without the slightest doubt.